The chamber is open and full of whispers.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive timelines, members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. There are nights when Hogwarts holds its breath. Not from fear, the castle is too ancient and too certain for that. It breathes the way mountains breathe, measuring time in centuries rather than minutes. And when something arrives that matters, it doesn't flinch. It pays attention. On the night Cornelius Fudge marched its corridors flanked by Aurors and Ministry seals, Hogwarts did something no book had recorded and no portrait had anticipated. It chose. Fudge's voice carried the resonance of a man who had been rehearsing this moment for weeks. It bounced off ancient stone and returned slightly flattened, as if the walls had absorbed it and found it insufficient. Students pressed themselves against tapestries and into doorways. A second-year Hufflepuff had started crying quietly near a tapestry and nobody had noticed, because everyone was watching the Minister for Magic stride toward the Headmaster's office, with the bearing of a man who had mistaken his own comfort for triumph. It wasn't a triumph. Anyone paying close attention could see that. Dumbledore stood at the corridor intersection with his hands folded and his half-moon spectacles catching the torchlight, watching Fudge the way a very old mountain watches weather. The argument had already happened. The charges had already been read: conspiracy against the ministry, incitement of rebellion, the familiar arsenal of a government afraid of the truth it refused to name. Fudge's voice had risen during the reading, acquiring the theatrical quality of someone performing certainty for a skeptical audience. Percy Weasley stood behind him, holding documents, his face arranged into an expression of official gravity that cost him something visible from 50 feet away, a cost he had apparently decided was worth paying, though his jaw said otherwise. The other teachers lined the corridor's edges. McGonagall stood with her arms folded in a way that communicated volumes without a word. Flitwick had gone very still. Sprout had dirt on her hands from the greenhouse and had not thought to clean it off before coming, which was its own kind of statement. Even Snape, whose expression betrayed nothing as a professional discipline, had positioned himself 3 inches further from the Aurors than from the students, a small geometry that nobody mentioned but several people registered. Then it was simply over, in the way something ends when the person at its center decides it does. There was no speech, no dramatic gesture. Albus Dumbledore looked at Fudge for one long, still moment, and the corridor changed. Not in temperature, not in light, but in weight. The way a room changes when something enormous and certain passes through it. A rush of fire, a rush of wind, and the greatest wizard of the age was gone, leaving behind empty stone, a minister who'd forgotten to blink, and a suit of armor near the window that shifted its metal foot with what might have been discomfort. Fudge stared at the space where Dumbledore had been. The silence stretched until a nearby portrait cleared its throat. Then Fudge turned to the small, pink-clad woman at his shoulder. "Your headmistress," he said. "Go to the office." Dolores Umbridge had been waiting for exactly this. She swept toward the stone gargoyle at the foot of the headmaster's staircase with the stride of someone claiming what was owed. She had the password, extracted from ministry files 3 days prior, because she prepared for things, and preparation was how she demonstrated she deserved what she was taking. She announced it. Her voice was sweet and entirely confident. The gargoyle did not move. She tried again. Those carved eyes held something that should not have been possible in granite. Judgment, a verdict rendered without breath or voice, behind surfaces that had no right to render anything at all. She raised her wand. The gargoyle's mouth opened, revealing teeth that were not decorative. Something in its posture, the slight lean forward, the angle of those stone teeth, communicated with absolute clarity what would occur if she pushed further. Dolores Umbridge lowered her wand. She adjusted her cardigan. She told herself this was a temporary administrative inconvenience, and walked back down the corridor with her chin elevated and her hands perfectly still. And she did not look back, because looking back would have made it real in a way she was not yet ready for. Behind her, the gargoyle settled. If carved stone could look satisfied, that one did. Harry Potter was not supposed to be on this floor. He had come because the castle's atmosphere had shifted. Not the noise level, not the temperature, but something beneath both. A pressure, the way air thickens before a storm when it takes on weight that has nothing to do with weather. 5 years in these corridors had taught him to feel the difference between ordinary Hogwarts and Hogwarts when it was paying attention to something. He came around the corner from the 5th-floor landing and stopped 20 feet from the gargoyle. Nothing about it had visibly changed. And yet, he didn't know why he walked toward it. He was 15 years old. Dumbledore had been driven out of his school by small men with ministry seals, and the closest thing to a reason he had was that something in this building felt unresolved, like a question with an obvious answer nobody had said aloud yet. He reached the gargoyle and stopped with his hand half extended, meaning to lean against it while he thought. His fingers touched its shoulder. The grinding of stone was different from any sound the castle usually produced. Slower, more deliberate, like something awakening rather than something activating. The gargoyle turned. The staircase rose, and the figure that had guarded this post for more than a century moved aside with a quality that had no other name but recognition. "Welcome," the stone said, without words. Harry walked up. The office was circular and high, and very old. The portraits of previous headmasters lined the walls, and they had been sleeping in their frames, but they weren't sleeping anymore. One by one, like lights coming on in a row of windows, faces of people who had held this desk and this responsibility turned toward him with expressions ranging from solemn to openly delighted. He recognized none of them. He recognized all of them, in the way you recognize something that has been waiting for you. The instruments on the delicate tables ticked and whirred. The phoenix perch stood empty, and the sight of it produced a clench in his chest he hadn't expected. The sorting hat sat on its shelf, and it was the hat that spoke first, without ceremony. Because ceremony was not what the moment required. "I have been waiting," it said, "for you." Harry looked at it. The hat's brim moved. "Not you specifically, perhaps. One waits for the shape of a person, not their name." The founders left instructions for the time when this school was in danger and its rightful heir finally arrived. The hat's voice carried layers beneath its surface, like a book read so many times the text has worn through the page. "Are you ready?" He looked around the office, at the enormous desk, at the claw-footed chair, at the window showing the Hogwarts grounds, the lake cold and still in the late evening light, the forbidden forest dark at its edge, the outer walls lit by ancient torches that had been burning in some form for 1,000 years. "I don't know," he said, because pretending to certainty he didn't feel had never been something he was built for. "That," said the hat, "is exactly the right answer." What followed was not ceremony. There was no speech, no formal declaration, no assembled witnesses. The sorting hat descended from its shelf with a kind of quiet purpose, and settled onto the head of a 15-year-old boy in round glasses and school robes, and an expression of terrified determination. And from within it, from some space adjacent to ordinary magic, it drew out a circlet, metal that caught firelight in ways metal without intention could not, because the intention had been in it for 1,000 years. 4 intentions, 4 founders, 4 different magical philosophies compressed into a single object, waiting. It settled on Harry's head, and the castle spoke, not in words, in warmth, in recognition, in the sensation of being known by something vast and patient that had been watching him for years and was only now choosing to say so. He gripped the arms of the headmaster's chair as the school's awareness poured through him, not overwhelming, not commanding, but orienting the way a compass orients when you stop spinning it. Every corridor, every classroom, every sleeping student, and every watching portrait, and every flagstone he had ever walked on. The roots of the thing, the deep magic in the foundation stones, the accumulated weight of 10 centuries of learning and protecting and hoping. The castle knew him. It had always known him. It was waiting for him to know it back. He breathed. He held the armrests until the sensation settled into something he could carry. Around the walls, the portraits began to applaud. One by one, beginning with the woman in the largest frame, whose face was grave and proud and entirely unfamiliar to him, until every painted face in the room was doing the same thing. He sat in the chair for a long time without speaking. Eventually, he picked up a piece of parchment, found a quill, and wrote in handwriting that would never be tidy. "Hermione, come to the headmaster's office." H. A house elf appeared before he'd finished, looking for a way to send it. He handed over the note. The elf vanished with the quiet efficiency that house elves deployed when the castle had already communicated what was needed. He sat back, looked at the ceiling. "She'll want to see the charter documents immediately," said a portrait of a gray-bearded man in the lower left corner. "She'll have already read the relevant sections," said a woman in green robes from the upper right. "The question is whether she's marked the pages." "She'll have marked the pages," said a third decisively. Harry almost smiled. He found the small bronze plate beside the inner door. the one each headmaster maintained with their chosen password. He crossed out whatever had been written there and replaced it with 2 words: sherbet lemon. The plate accepted the change with a soft, warm glow that faded quickly. Every portrait in the room smiled at once, the particular smile of people recognizing something being honored that deserves to be honored. Harry set the quill down and waited for Hermione. She had brought a book. Of course she had. She arrived at the headmaster's office with her hair escaping its braid at 3 separate points and a copy of Hogwarts: A History under one arm and an expression Harry had spent 5 years learning to read. It was the expression she wore when something had already happened and she was working at full speed to process it before it finished happening. Controlled velocity, the face of someone running while appearing entirely still. She looked at the office, at the portraits watching her with expressions ranging from curiosity to open delight, at the magical instruments ticking on their tables, at the sorting hat, at the desk that was no longer Dumbledore's desk, at Harry behind it, with the crown of the Founders on his head and his school robes looking completely inadequate to the occasion. She set the book on the nearest surface. She sat in the chair across from him. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that one of the portraits cleared its throat delicately, which both of them ignored. "Tell me," she said. "Everything." He told her. She did not interrupt, which was unusual. Hermione in any other context would have questions at intervals, corrections where his terminology was imprecise. Instead, she listened with her hands flat on her knees, and the full weight of her attention given over entirely to hearing him rather than responding to him. When he finished, the office was quiet except for the instruments and the distant shifting of a portrait frame. She reached for the book. She opened it near the back, not hesitantly, not searching. Directly to a page with a worn fold at its corner she had clearly returned to before. She turned the book so he could see the text, one finger resting below a passage he would not have known to look for. "Emergency succession," she said, "in cases where the recognized headmaster is removed by external force rather than voluntary departure or death. Section 41. She looked at him. "I read this in 3rd year." Harry stared at her. "You read the succession laws in 3rd year." "I read everything in 3rd year. I had the time turner." A pause. "I also read them because I thought someone should know them, in case." She folded her hands. "I didn't imagine it would be relevant this soon. Or that it would be me." She held his gaze steadily. "Or that it would be you." There was nothing unkind in how she said it. Only the honesty of someone whose model of the world has just been updated by something unexpected, and who is doing the update in real time without complaining about it. He watched her do it. It took approximately 4 seconds. "All right," she said. "The charter." She opened the book to a different section. She talked for 40 minutes. Harry listened the way he listened when Hermione was explaining something that genuinely mattered, not performing attention, but actually giving it, following the thread of her argument through legal precedents, historical framework, and the specific language of the Founders' original documents. She covered the Wardstone, the sovereign succession, the ancient distinction between a school that exists under a government's authority and one that predates that government entirely. "The legal term in the charter," she said finally, "is custos perpetuus, eternal custodian. It doesn't mean eternal in duration, it means total in commitment. The custodian holds the school's authority absolutely, for the duration of their tenure, without exception or condition, except one. The welfare of the students is the only constraint on headmaster authority. Every power the position carries exists to protect that, and nothing else." Harry was quiet for a moment. "And the ministry?" "The ministry was established in the early 18th century. She set the book down. "Hogwarts was founded around 990 AD. The charter was written before the ministry existed, before the International Confederation of Wizards existed, before the Statute of Secrecy was even a concept. The charter doesn't grant the ministry jurisdiction over the school, because when the charter was written, the ministry wasn't available to be granted anything. They'll say it's been superseded. They'll try. The argument doesn't hold. You cannot supersede a sovereign compact with general legislation passed by a body that had no authority over the original compact. That's not how law works. Muggle or magical." She paused. "I have 17 precedents. I started writing the brief 6 hours ago." Harry blinked. "You started the brief before I sent you the note." "I started writing when I heard the gargoyle move." She met his eyes without apology. "Sound travels in old stone." I was on the 4th floor. The silence that followed was the comfortable kind. Harry leaned back in the headmaster's chair, which fit him in a way that had nothing to do with dimensions. "I need a deputy headmistress," he said. Hermione went very still. "The charter," he began. "I know what the charter says about the administrative partner." Her voice was careful. "I read it twice. Then you know the position carries a Wizengamot seat and access to the private library. And, Harry," she stopped him, "I'm 16. I know. I'm a 5th-year student. I know that too. The ministry will absolutely lose their minds." He looked at her. "I know. I'm counting on it." She was quiet. Outside the window, the Hogwarts grounds lay in the deep dark after midnight. The lake invisible, the forest a dense shadow at the edge of perception, the outer walls lit by torches that had been burning in some form for centuries. The fire in the grate had settled into low coals. "The administrative partner position," Hermione said carefully, "is historically held for the duration of the headmaster's tenure. The compensation is room, board, access to the private library, and a seat at the Wizengamot as representative of the school charter." She paused. "They'll have to give us the seat." "The charter predates the Wizengamot. They cannot refuse without invalidating the entire legal framework they're operating under, and they cannot do that without also invalidating their own claim to jurisdiction over magical schools. So they're trapped either way." Comprehensively, she looked at him across the desk. "You've already thought about this. Some of it. Will you do it?" he asked. She set the book down. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes. I decided approximately 5 minutes into your explanation. I've just been establishing the legal basis." The headmaster's suite was up a second staircase behind a door in the office's northern wall. The castle opened it as they approached, the handle turning under Harry's hand as if it had been expecting him, which it had, a fact he was still absorbing in the part of his mind not occupied with everything else. Inside was warmth, not from a recently lit fire, but the warmth of a room that had been warm for a very long time, that had absorbed decades of firelight into its stones and dark wooden floors. The tapestries had achieved the richness of things looked at for generations. Reds and blues deepened by age into something closer to memory than pigment. The rugs glowed faintly, not with illumination, but with the residue of 1,000 years of magic seeping into their fibers. The study had 2 desks facing each other across a hearth, where a fire already burned, lit by the castle, because the castle knew. Behind a carved wooden door was the private library. Hermione went to the doorway and looked in without entering, reading spines in the dark with a focused hunger Harry recognized as the closest she came to reverence. The sitting room between the 2 bedrooms had a window seat and a view that made both of them stop. From this height, at this angle, everything that mattered was visible. The grounds in their entirety, the lake, the forest, the Quidditch pitch, the outer walls with their towers catching starlight. Every torch flame in the school was visible from here, hundreds of small, persistent lights against the dark. Hermione stood at the window for a long time. "We're going to need to tell Ron," she said. "Tomorrow. He's going to argue that being your best friend counts as a qualification for something. It doesn't." "No," she agreed. "But maybe Warden." Harry looked at her. She was still looking at the view. 500 lights in a school that was also, as of tonight, something more than a school. Something that had been waiting for this and was now, in the patient way of very old things, ready. "Maybe Warden," he agreed. They worked through the early hours at the 2 desks in the study, facing each other across the hearth. It became a rhythm, Harry reading from the Heartstone's Guide, a small handwritten volume found in the desk's hidden drawer, the text in 4 distinct hands that shifted between pages as the founders' voices traded off, while Hermione drafted documents in her rapid, precise script, the quill barely lifting between lines. Every so often, one of them would say something, a question, a fact, a clarification, and the other would answer without looking up, because proximity was enough, and thinking ran better in parallel. On Harry's desk, the Heartstone Guide lay open to a passage written in a hand pressed harder into the page than the others. Ink darker from a heavier dip. Godric Gryffindor's, as it turned out. The passage was about the Wardstone's deepest function, which was not military protection, but recognition. The school's ability to know its own. Outside, the sky above the forbidden forest began to lose its depth, the absolute dark of deep night becoming the conditional dark of approaching dawn. The fire burned down to coals. Neither of them moved to add wood, and the castle, which knew, did it for them. The student body came to breakfast carrying fragments. They knew about the Aurors in the corridors, the way certain portraits had gone very still and then suddenly very animated, the particular hush that had settled over the castle like sediment after Dumbledore's departure. They knew Umbridge had swept through the main corridor in the small hours with her chin raised and something behind her eyes that was not triumph. They knew the gargoyle had not moved for her. That last piece of information had traveled the dormitories faster than anything, because Hogwarts students understood, at a level below language, that the gargoyle's refusal meant something, even if none of them could yet name what. Umbridge sat in the high table's central chair, which had shifted approximately 8 inches to the right of where it ought to be, as if the stone floor beneath it had developed a preference about who it was willing to support and where. She sat in it anyway, in her most authoritative pink robes, presiding over a silence that was almost brittle. Flitwick's expression was the most carefully neutral, which meant he was feeling the most. McGonagall looked as if she'd been carved from the same stone as the walls. Snape, at the far end, appeared to be examining the middle distance for structural flaws. Then the doors opened. Harry Potter walked into the Great Hall. Hermione Granger walked at his left shoulder. They were not rushing. Whatever this was, it had not been improvised. It moved at the exact speed of something planned with care and now being executed with intention. Harry wore Headmaster's robes, deep red-black, the Hogwarts crest at the breast, robes that had no business on a 15-year-old, and that nonetheless fit him in a way that had nothing to do with tailoring. The crown of the Founders caught the candlelight and did something with it that ordinary metal could not. Not reflection, something closer to recognition, the light finding the object familiar. Hermione wore deep blue and carried a scroll and a quill, and wore the expression of someone who had been awake since 2 a.m. completing something that mattered, and had arrived at the moment of its use, feeling exactly as prepared as she needed to be. The Great Hall went silent, not gradually, the way a flame goes out when air is removed, completely and all at once. 500 students turned to look, and the room held the stillness of people experiencing something their minds hadn't quite caught up to yet. Harry did not walk to the Gryffindor table. He walked to the front of the room, and the space between the house tables opened for him with the unconscious movement of people making way for something they don't yet have a name for. "Good morning," he said. Such an ordinary thing to say that the silence after it became extraordinary, a cavity where something dramatic had been expected, and something quiet arrived instead. He looked at the room, at the students, at the teachers, at the high table where Umbridge had risen from her slightly wrong chair with her wand at her side, expression cycling through indignation and calculation. "Hermione," he said. She stepped forward, unrolled the scroll, and read. Her voice carried to every corner of the hall without effort. 5 years of answering classroom questions had given her a carrying voice that was one of her more underappreciated qualities. "By authority of the Founders' Charter of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, I, Henry James Potter, Sovereign Headmaster and bearer of the Heartstone's recognition, do hereby declare the ministry appointment of Dolores Jane Umbridge as Headmistress of Hogwarts null and void, said appointment having been made without authority over a sovereign institution." The silence acquired texture. Students leaned forward. A third-year Ravenclaw had her quill out. Susan Bones at the Hufflepuff table had stopped eating entirely. Neville Longbottom was leaning so far forward his elbows had left the bench. Umbridge's face had begun its journey through colors, cycling through the expression of a person whose authority has been questioned in a very public place, and who is calculating how to reassert it. "Furthermore," Hermione continued, "the following persons are hereby exiled from the grounds of Hogwarts School, its castle, its lands, and the village of Hogsmeade, effective immediately and pending review." She read the names of the inquisitorial squad members. Each one landed like a stone in still water. Draco Malfoy's name was read with the same cadence as the rest, neither emphasized nor softened. Pansy Parkinson, several others who had spent months with silver badges and the particular cruelty of people given power over their peers, and who had not used it well. Draco Malfoy opened his mouth. Harry looked at him, not with rage. 5 years of anger had burned out somewhere in the night, replaced by something more complicated and less comfortable, something that might eventually become pity if he let it develop. What was on Harry's face now was simple clarity, the expression of someone who has looked at a situation from every angle and knows exactly what it is. Draco closed his mouth. Umbridge's exit was handled by the castle. The flagstones beneath her chair tipped, not dramatically, not enough to throw her, not enough to point to as an attack, just enough to make continued sitting untenable. The movement was almost polite, the way the nudge of a current is polite. The doors to the great hall opened. Every door between the hall and the main gates opened in sequence. Harry felt it happen through the castle's awareness, each threshold presenting itself as the obvious next step in a very clear direction. The suits of armor in the corridor beyond turned to face inward, not threateningly, but with the focused attention of things that have been given a job. The portraits along the corridor began to murmur, individual voices building into a collective sound, not words exactly, but the unmistakable texture of a very old building that has made up its mind. She swept out. The doors closed after her passage with a finality that was not loud, but was complete. The headmaster's chair slid back to the center of the high table with a sound like an exhale. 500 students turned to look at Harry Potter. "I know some of you are scared," he said. He said it the way Harry Potter said things that were true, without performance, without the scaffolding of reassurance around it. "That's sensible. This is unprecedented." He looked at the room, at faces he'd spent 5 years living among, the ones he knew well, and the ones he only recognized, the ones carefully neutral, and the ones not hiding what they felt. But nothing that happens in this school happens to you anymore. It happens with you, or it doesn't happen. He paused. "Hogwarts is yours. It's always been yours. We're just making it official." 1 second of silence. Maybe 2. It was broken by Neville Longbottom, who had at some point during the proceedings crossed from the Gryffindor table to stand near the Hufflepuffs, beside Susan Bones, who had been crying quietly for the last several minutes and had not been crying alone. He began to clap, deliberately, personally, the clap of someone who means it rather than someone following a crowd. He was the right person to start it. The sound spread through the hall in the way genuine things spread, finding people who were ready and waiting for the rest. Hufflepuff came in early, Ravenclaw a beat later. Gryffindor, already halfway there. The Slytherin table was quieter, not silent, but measured, some hands moving and some not. This was appropriate. The situation deserved considered responses. Harry looked at the room and felt the castle's awareness warm behind his eyes. He looked at Hermione. She had rolled the scroll back up and was watching with the careful attention of someone cataloging data she'd need later. She caught his eye, gave him the small, precise nod that meant, "Yes, now what?" He turned back to the room. "Breakfast is getting cold," he said. "You should eat." The hall's answering sound was not quite laughter, and not quite relief, and was, somehow, exactly right. Lucius Malfoy arrived at precisely the kind of hour that communicates its own message, early enough to imply that the people he was calling upon were not worth informality. He came by Ministry Portkey, landing 20 feet from the outer gates with a crack that carried in the cold morning air. He brought 2 solicitors who walked slightly behind and apart, present to suggest that whatever was about to happen had a foundation solid enough to require professional witnesses. He carried a letter bearing the ministry's ministerial crest, and below it, in darker wax, the pressed seals of 3 Board of Governors members. He looked, as he always did, like someone who had not yet been told he couldn't have something and did not believe today would be the first time. The gates did not open. Harry was already there. He had come down from the office an hour prior, felt the gates through the castle's awareness, and waited. He had not brought Hermione for appearances. She was in the study with the brief open, maintaining the focused calm of someone who has finished building the weapon and is now waiting to hear whether it's needed. He knew she was there the way he knew where all the students were. He walked to the gates. He stood on the interior side and looked at Lucius Malfoy through the iron. Malfoy looked back. The morning was very cold and very still. Malfoy presented his credentials through the bars with practiced efficiency, the movement carrying none of the indignity a less composed man might show at having to pass documents through a barrier. He explained, with elaborate patience, that as a duly appointed Board of Governors member, he held the legal right of access for governance review, that the ministry had issued a directive requiring immediate assessment, that the appointment of Harry Potter to any administrative position was not merely irregular, but flatly illegal under the ministry's Educational Authority Act of the early 20th century. Harry interrupted him, not rudely, quietly. The Board of Governors was established in the early 17th century by the Wizards' Council Act on Educational Oversight. He said it as a fact, not the opening of an argument. because an argument implies two comparable positions, and this was not that. The Hogwarts Charter was signed in approximately 990 AD. This school existed as a sovereign institution for over 600 years before the board had any legal standing whatsoever. He looked at Malfoy through the bars. Under the Sovereign Institution Clause, which predates and supersedes the board's enabling legislation, the Sovereign Headmaster has the right to revoke board access to the grounds at will, pending Wizengamot Charter review. He paused. Hermione, from the inner courtyard, where she had apparently been standing for several minutes in the cold morning air with her arms crossed and her scroll already open, because of course she had, Hermione's voice arrived with carrying precision. Under Article 17 of the Pre-Ministry Wizarding Sovereign Institutions Act, a board member who has previously held their seat through threats, undue coercion, or equivalent improper pressure against fellow board members is permanently disqualified from membership and loses all access rights retroactively. She did not look up from the scroll. Evidence of Mr. Malfoy's conduct during a board meeting some years prior, in which he threatened and coerced fellow governors into signing the suspension order removing Albus Dumbledore from his post, has been sworn to by 3 board members in affidavits submitted to the Wizengamot clerk this morning, before dawn. One of the solicitors made a sound that was not quite a word. Lucius Malfoy went very still. It was the stillness of a man whose entire professional existence is built on knowing which way the wind blows before it blows, who has just discovered the wind changed direction while he was looking elsewhere. His expression didn't break. Lucius Malfoy's expressions were controlled at a level that spoke to decades of practice, but something shifted behind his eyes. A recalculation, the movement of someone who has arrived at a door expecting it to open and found instead that the door is a load-bearing wall. "You're bluffing," he said. The word came out measured, but something behind it wasn't sure. "I'm not," Harry said. He produced a roll of parchment from inside his robes. He could tell from the ink compression and handwriting density which sections Hermione had written before midnight and which she'd written after, when she hit her second wind. "I'm also not angry. This isn't revenge, Mr. Malfoy. I don't hold you in enough importance for revenge. This is simply law." He held the parchment through the bars. Malfoy took it, read it with the speed of someone who processes complex legal documents regularly. His eyes moved down the page and back up. "The Wizengamot won't," one of the solicitors began. "The Wizengamot received a full copy of the charter documentation before breakfast this morning," Hermione said from the courtyard, still not looking up. "The charter clerk, in particular, has apparently been waiting for someone to file this documentation for approximately 3 centuries. She used the word finally, twice. Harry looked at Malfoy steadily, at the man who had arrived expecting a 15-year-old in over his head, and found instead a 15-year-old standing in front of something very old that had decided he belonged there. "Your son?" Harry said, and his voice changed, more careful now, each word chosen with awareness of what it carried. "Draco is permitted to remain as a student. A student is a ward of this school, not a representative of their family, while enrolled. His place here is protected under the Charter's student sovereignty provisions. He will not be penalized for choices made by others. One step back from the gate. But you are not permitted here. If you attempt to force entry, the castle will respond. I would strongly advise against discovering what that means in practice." He looked at Malfoy for a long moment, at the pale, composed face, the cane, the robes that cost more than most wizarding families earned in a year, and felt nothing that qualified as anger. What he felt was something more complicated, the awareness of a man who had spent his entire life operating under the assumption that certain rules applied to other people, encountering for possibly the first time the experience of being the other people. Lucius Malfoy held the parchment. He looked at Harry. He looked at Hermione, who had finally looked up and was meeting his gaze with the clear, steady patience of someone who has read every relevant law and harbors no remaining uncertainty about any of it. He looked at the castle behind them, looked at it a moment longer than necessary, with an expression that was almost uncertain, because the castle was doing the thing it did now, looking back, not with malice, with the patient, comprehensive awareness of something very old that has formed an opinion and sees no reason to hide it. He turned without a word, snapped the ministry letter in half, one clean motion, hands needing something to do, and walked back toward his portkey. The solicitors fell into step behind him. 20 feet away, the junior solicitor said, almost apologetically, "Sir, the Wizengamot won't be able to—" "I know," Lucius said. His voice held a quality it didn't usually carry. Not defeat. Lucius Malfoy would not permit that in his own voice. Possibly ever. But something adjacent. The sound of a man running private arithmetic on what a changed board means for everything else he has built. He did not look back. Harry watched him go until the crack of the portkey activation carried across the cold air. Then the castle was quiet around him. Hermione appeared at his shoulder, rolling the scroll back up from memory. "The clerk really was pleased," she said. "I spoke to her by flu before the sun rose. She said the documentation had been sitting in the archive for 3 centuries, waiting for someone to act on it." A pause. She said it in a tone that suggested she had personally been waiting 3 centuries. "Welcome to magical law," Harry said. "Shall we go over the curriculum review? I've drafted the initial assessment, and I need your opinion on which of Trelawney's crystal balls are actually enchanted versus which ones she simply waves her hands over." Harry thought briefly about Draco Malfoy sitting at the Slytherin table right now, working out what it meant that his father had been turned away, and that the person who had turned him away had, in the same breath, protected Draco's right to remain. "Let's go in," he said. Behind them, the gates held their closed, settled stillness. Draco Malfoy came to the headmaster's office 3 weeks later. He came in the evening without an appointment, which took more nerve than Harry had expected to see from him. He stood in the doorway with the careful posture of someone who has rehearsed the first line of a conversation several times, and is now discovering that the actual moment is different from the rehearsal. "You protected my place here," Draco said. "It was not quite a question, and not quite a statement. When you exiled the squad, you protected my enrollment." Harry set down the ward diagram. "Yes, my father will call it strategic. He'll say you did it because having me here gives you leverage. Your father can think whatever he wants. It doesn't change what I did or why." Draco's jaw tightened slightly. "Then why?" Harry looked at him, at the boy who had been performing his father since platform 9 3/4, at 11 years old, at the person underneath the performance who had never been offered a different role to play. "Because this school doesn't punish students for the choices their parents made. That's not what it's for." Silence. Draco looked at the portraits, at the sorting hat, at the desk. The desk that had been Dumbledore's and before him hundreds of others, and was now occupied by a boy 2 months younger than himself. "He's going to lose," Draco said quietly. "Not his father. Voldemort." They both understood which he was being named. Harry did not answer immediately. He let the statement sit in the room and be what it was. Not a question, not a declaration, but a recognition aloud of something Draco had been turning over for a long time in the privacy of his own thoughts. "Probably," Harry said finally, "but that's not the reason to choose differently. The reason to choose differently is because of what you have to live with after." Another silence, longer this time. Then Draco said in a voice stripped entirely of the Malfoy performance, "What if the differently is too late?" "It's never completely too late," Harry said. "It's just more expensive the longer you wait." Draco looked at him for one more moment, and then he left without a word. But he left differently from how he had entered, with the particular bearing of someone who has said something out loud for the first time and discovered that saying it did not break anything. Harry watched the door close and sat quietly for a moment. "That was well handled," said Dilys Derwent from the upper left portrait in a tone that suggested she did not dispense compliments carelessly. Harry picked up the ward diagram. "I'm not sure it was handling," he said. "I'm not sure he needed handling. I think he just needed someone to be in the room while he figured it out." Dilys considered this. "Yes," she said. "That is, in fact, what most people need." The assessment chart was 3 feet long. Hermione produced it 2 mornings after the Gates confrontation, unrolling it across the study's larger desk with the deliberateness of someone presenting evidence, rather than making an argument, because she had always understood that the strongest arguments look like evidence. Color-coded in 4 distinct inks: deep blue for subjects performing well on both content and pedagogical axes, green for good content with delivery problems, amber for subjects needing significant revision, and a red she had used sparingly and with what appeared to be restrained satisfaction. 2 subjects occupied the bottom left quadrant, surrounded by a significant amount of empty space. She had labeled them in her most precise handwriting: History of Magic, bins. Essentially, 0 educational output, and divination. Trelawney, high entertainment value, low magical return. Harry looked at it for a long time. "You color-coded it. Obviously. You made a 2-axis assessment grid for all 12 subjects." I separated astronomy from its mathematical component, which I maintain is justified. She pointed to an annotation in the corner. I started this in 4th year. I've been updating it since. He looked at her. Someone had to, she said. The teacher meetings happened across 3 days. Flitwick came in cautious and left 3 hours later in something that could only be described as academic rapture, having agreed to design an entirely new subject from scratch. McGonagall's session was the longest. She came in with her characteristic armor of precision, and within 20 minutes had abandoned it in favor of the kind of direct professional conversation Harry suspected she had not been able to have with an employer in years. She had opinions about the curriculum. She had been having them for a long time. Sprout's meeting ended with Harry agreeing to speak to the castle about expanding herbology's practical grounds, and Sprout departing with the mild glow of someone whose professional dreams have just unexpectedly become negotiable. Snape sent a note rather than coming when called. A single line in the spare vertical handwriting Harry had been reading on returned essays for 5 years. I will attend at 8 this evening if the schedule remains open. Harry wrote back, "It does." He added nothing. Neither did Snape. Binns's meeting was not a meeting in any conventional sense. The ghost of Professor Cuthbert Binns had been teaching history of magic at Hogwarts since he died at his desk sometime in the early 20th century, and had not, by all available evidence, noticed. Students who passed through his classroom emerged knowing nothing of substance about the rich, genuinely fascinating magical history of Britain, which was itself a kind of historical indictment. Harry went to the classroom himself at the start of the 2nd period. Binns was mid-sentence about the Goblin rebellions. Students were experiencing sleep as a public activity. Harry stood at the front. The room went quiet with a speed that had been increasing daily as the school recalibrated. He produced the Imperial Education Order Hermione had drafted, citing the Custodian's Compact's provisions on educational delivery standards. He handed it to Binns. The ghost took it with transparent fingers and read it with the slow attention of someone who had lost, somewhere in the decades since his death, the habit of reading things that mattered. Then he stopped. He read it again. He looked up at Harry with an expression that moved through confusion, then something that might have been relief, then settled into the peace of something very old being given permission to stop. "Ah," said Professor Binns. He set the paper on the lecture podium. He looked at the classroom, at 30 students watching him with every expression except engagement. He nodded once, with the deliberate finality of someone making intentional a gesture they had been making by inertia for years. He drifted through the wall. He did not come back. The classroom was completely silent. A 4th-year girl at the back said, very quietly, Did that just? Yes, Harry said. New subject begins Monday. Ancient sorcery. Professor Flitwick is teaching it. I'd recommend chapters 1 through 3 of the preliminary text over the weekend. A Ravenclaw in the 2nd row already had parchment out. It was Dilys Derwent who brought him the idea. She appeared at Harry's shoulder on the 4th evening as he and Hermione were reviewing the ward diagram, and cleared her throat in the delicate way that meant she had something important to say and had been waiting for an appropriate pause. Harry had learned to distinguish between portraits clearing their throats for attention and portraits clearing their throats because they had information. This was unmistakably the latter. There is something, Dilly said carefully, that the headmasters of this school have never fully used. Harry and Hermione both looked up. Most people understand that portraits can move between their frames, she said. What fewer consider is where those frames are located. She straightened in her painted chair. My secondary portrait hangs in St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries. Everard's secondary portrait is in the ministry itself, the corridor adjacent to the minister's outer office. Phineas Nigellus Black's secondary portrait hangs at number 12, Grimmauld Place. She paused. We have been sitting in these locations for decades, listening to everything said within earshot, with nowhere useful to take what we hear. Harry and Hermione looked at each other. Until now, Hermione said. What followed was one of the most unusual conversations Harry had during his tenure. A strategic planning session conducted with people who had been dead for between 50 and 300 years, who had access to some of the most sensitive locations in the wizarding world, and who had, collectively, been bored for a very long time and were ready to do something about it. By midnight they had mapped it. Dilys would monitor healing ward admissions at St. Mungo's, which would signal Death Eater activity and its aftermath before official reports reached the ministry. Everard's position near the minister's office meant he could relay the tenor of internal discussions, the conversations in corridors, the body language of officials entering and leaving meetings, the things bureaucracies communicate in their edges rather than their centers. Phineas Nigellus, acerbic, brilliant, and deeply unwilling to admit he found the work genuinely interesting, agreed to monitor Grimmauld Place for any intelligence flowing through Order of the Phoenix operations there. "You are establishing a spy network," Phineas said flatly. "We are establishing an information-sharing system among consenting parties," Hermione said. "The portraits retain complete autonomy over what they share and when." He looked at Harry. "You are considerably less tiresome than I expected." "Thank you," Harry said. "That was not intended as a compliment." "I know," Harry said. "I'm taking it as one anyway." Phineas made a sound of profound irritation and disappeared to his other frame. The portrait network became quietly one of the most important developments of the year, what no Auror report or Ministry owl could provide. The texture of how the war was actually moving, the small signals that preceded large events, the network supplied with the steady patience of people who had nothing but time, and had decided to spend it usefully. It was Dilys who first reported the signs of Dementor unrest, not a breakout, but a pattern. Certain prisoners receiving fewer meals, guards rotating on irregular schedules, the specific administrative shuffle of a ministry quietly reassigning its Dementor warden staff. Hermione cross-referenced it with 3 other data points from Everard's corridor reports, and produced a memorandum at 3 a.m. summarizing what she was 93% certain would be a formal Dementor defection within the season. She was right. She was, characteristically right. The first Serpent Lion Guard briefing, to include portrait intelligence, produced a long silence among the students present, followed by Luna Lovegood, who had been quietly sitting in the back corner since the 3rd session, invited by no one and uninvited by no one, whose presence Harry had decided was probably deliberate on the castle's part. Raising her hand, "Have you considered asking the ghosts?" she said. "They can go where portraits can't." Harry looked at her. She looked back with the serene, lateral certainty that made conversations with Luna feel like being handed a lens ground at a different angle from every other lens you owned. "No," he said. "I hadn't thought of that." "Nearly Headless Nick knows things," Luna said helpfully. "He's been at several important dinners. Ghosts get invited to things. People forget they're listening." She was not wrong. The subsequent conversation with Sir Nicholas de Mimsy Porpington, who was flattered beyond anything Harry had previously seen in a ghost, and who agreed immediately and at some length, producing over the following weeks some of the most detailed intelligence on Death Eater social gatherings the war effort had yet encountered, was one of the stranger diplomatic achievements of Harry's tenure, and possibly the one he was most privately proud of. He told Hermione about the chamber at the desk after dinner one evening, explaining what he had felt through the Heartstone's connection 3 nights prior. Not the cold presence of something dangerous, but something more complicated. Depth, layers, the texture of something very old that had not finished being what it was. "The chamber has been sealed since my 2nd year," he said. "The basilisk's body is still down there. I know because the castle knows." He paused. "It doesn't feel like a body." Hermione set down her quill. "Explain that more precisely," he tried. He said that when he connected to the Heartstone fully, the castle's awareness was less like a map and more like a sense of weather. Different rooms with different textures. The way different parts of the same building feel different to someone who knows it well. Most of the castle felt like itself. The chamber felt like itself and something else, simultaneously. Something that moved very slowly and breathed very rarely, but was unambiguously present. Hermione was quiet for a long time. "Basilisks are classified at the highest danger category," she said, in the tone she used when drawing on something she'd read and choosing words carefully to match its precision. Some of the older magizoology texts describe a property found in extremely ancient specimens, not confirmed, flagged as theoretical, where age of sufficient magnitude produces something like distributed awareness, the consciousness becoming less centralized. Harry was quiet. Less centralized. Seeping into the environment. She looked at him steadily, into stone, into walls. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly what it feels like." Another silence. "I want to go down," he said. "I know. I need to go alone. The chamber responds to a single parcel mouth. A group would disrupt the resonance. I know that too." She pulled parchment toward her and began writing. 2 mirrors, primary and secondary, for the gaze. A shield charm set to activate on proximity contact, keyed to your magical signature. A bezoar, which doesn't address basilisk venom specifically, but covers other contingencies. She kept writing, I'll prepare a phoenix feather stasis potion for the study. It won't neutralize basilisk venom. Nothing short of phoenix tears can do that, and Fox is gone, but it can slow the body's response enough to matter if something goes wrong. I'll also have the flu to St. Mungo's open and Dilly's on alert through the portrait network. Hermione, I'm not arguing about whether you go. She looked up. I'm making sure that if something goes wrong, you don't die of it. He looked at her, at the parchment already filling with rapid preparation notes, drawn from memory with the casual fluency of someone who has read every relevant page and kept what mattered. Start the preparation, he said. He went at midnight. The second-floor girls' bathroom was cold and dim, the dripping tap a sound so constant it had stopped being a sound. Moaning Myrtle was absent. The castle had arranged things to give him the room to himself. He looked at the sink with the serpent on the tap. He had not spoken Parseltongue with intention since his second year. The capacity came from the soul fragment Voldemort's killing curse had deposited in him, and using it always carried the cold draft of an interior room he'd rather not open. Tonight he opened it anyway. The sink moved, the entrance opened. He went down. The chamber was lit only by his wand, and he kept his eyes on the mirror in his left hand, tracking the reflection rather than looking at the space directly. The old precaution. But the chamber was different from how he remembered it. He had been here once, in terror, with a sword and a dying phoenix overhead, and the tunnel vision of someone operating entirely on instinct. He had not been able to see the place then. Now he could. It was vast. It was ancient in the way certain places are ancient. Not simply old, but saturated with age. Stone walls having absorbed centuries of being what they are. The carved serpent columns rose to a ceiling the wand light couldn't fully reach. The green of the deep lake above filtered through the rock in a way that shouldn't have been physically possible. Some enchantment of the original construction making the chamber feel like the bottom of a world rather than the bottom of a building. And at the far end, the basilisk. Enormous. He had known this. He had stood beside it and killed it, and been dying from its venom at the time, which meant the scale had not properly registered. It registered now. The length of it, the weight, the body preserved by the chamber's magic in a stasis that was not quite death and not quite anything else. 3 years of lying still in deep stone, and the stone had grown to meet it. The walls at the far end had changed, something in the texture of the rock, something that moved at the very edge of perception, something that breathed. He connected to the Heartstone's awareness and felt the difference immediately. Not the surface magic, something deeper, slower, the quality of something dreaming rather than absent. He held the awareness and breathed, and waited, and after a moment felt the thing inside the stone notice him waiting. He spoke in the formal Parselmouth address the Heartstone guide had contained, not the command register Tom Riddle had always used, but something older, labeled in the guide as address of recognition, the way you might greet something that deserves acknowledgement rather than instruction. He named himself, not Harry Potter, that meant nothing in this language. He described himself, the one who came with a blade, the one who had always spoken to serpent kind, without understanding what he was doing, the one who carried in a scar on his forehead a fragment of the voice that had once called her from sleep and bent her to purposes that were not hers. The chamber was very still. Then the walls moved, not physically, not in any way his eyes could track, but through the Heartstone's awareness the enormous slow presence in the stone turned its attention toward him, the way a very large creature turns, not quickly, but completely. It considered him. He did not speak again. He let the truth sit there, and he waited. When the basilisk spoke, it came through stone rather than air. Not a sound his ears could hear, but a vibration the Heartstone carried into his awareness, translated by the castle's ancient magic into something he could understand. You killed me, not accusation, only a fact that had taken a long time to fully understand. Yes, he said, and you are here. Yes, the school sent you. He thought about this. The accuracy was not quite right and not quite wrong. I came. The school knew I was coming. A long pause, the kind that exists in a mind that has been part of stone for 3 years and has lost the habit of urgency. What does the heir of the school want from the dead? The same thing it wanted from you when you were alive. A guardian, someone who knows these walls from the inside. The response was not words. It was a shift in attention, something remote becoming fractionally less so, something warming very slightly in the stone around him. The other one commanded, it said. He spoke the language, and he commanded. I know, you are not commanding, no. Why Harry thought about what it means to be asked rather than told, about the school's deepest magic responding to sincerity rather than force, about the difference between a tool and an ally. Because I want you to choose, he said. The school is yours as much as mine. You have been in its walls longer than I have. If you guard it, it should be because you want to, not because someone with the right language told you to. The chamber was completely still. Then, from the walls, from the stone, from the patient depths. Yes, it said, I will guard. He climbed back up the pipe and found Hermione in the bathroom, sitting cross-legged on the cold floor, with the stasis kit beside her and a book on her knee she clearly wasn't reading. She looked at him, then at the sealed entrance. He told her everything. She closed her eyes when he described the distributed consciousness in the walls. When she opened them, she had the expression of someone who has just identified a new category of problem. The venom is still in the body, she said, which is now in the walls, which connect to the Heartstone. Yes, you asked a 1,000-year-old creature dissolved into stone to become the school's deepest guardian, and it agreed. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. That is, she said, actually remarkable. She stood and began packing the stasis kit with the efficient calm of someone returning equipment that wasn't needed, which was itself a kind of relief. The ward implications are significant. If the basilisk's awareness is now an additional layer of the castle's defensive architecture, we need to map how it interacts with the existing Heartstone enchantments. A pause. I'll need to revise the ward diagram. Of course you will. Also, she said, the next time you go into the Chamber of Secrets alone at midnight, I would appreciate more than 4 hours' notice. I gave you enough time to prepare. That's not the same thing. He looked at her, at the expression she wore when stating something he was being obtuse about, which was one of her most familiar expressions, and which meant, in their particular shorthand, that she had been afraid and was expressing that fear as a professional grievance, which was probably the most Hermione way to be afraid of anything. More notice next time, he said. There should not be a next time, but if there is. More notice, she said firmly, and a phoenix feather in your pocket, not just a bizarre. They walked back toward the stairs together. Somewhere far below in the deep stone, the ancient guardian breathed its slow, patient breath and kept watch over the walls of the school it had chosen to serve. Sirius arrived 12 days after Harry's letter reached him. He came at night, through the forbidden forest, moving his padfoot through the trees in a way that left no trace in Ministry detection equipment. Because the forest's ward perimeter, once Harry had access to the Heartstone, was no longer connected to Ministry monitoring. The forest was the school's, not the Ministry's, and the school did not report to anyone. Harry felt him at the edge of the grounds long before he reached the gates, the castle's awareness carrying the impression of something large and purposeful in the outer trees, something that had an old claim to this territory, even if it had never been formally articulated. He was waiting at the gates when Padfoot emerged from the tree line and crossed the open ground with the silent lope of a very large dog who has been traveling at speed for a long time, and is holding himself to a careful walk because running would feel like vulnerability. The transformation happened at the gates. Sirius Black unfolding from the dog's shape was always slightly uncanny to witness. The size shifting, the posture moving from something animal to something unmistakably human, something that had survived Azkaban and years of house arrest, and the specific attrition of being someone who needed to move and could not. He was gaunt, not the Azkaban gaunt. He had recovered some of that in the years since, but the gaunt of someone who had been too still, in too small a space, for too many months. The gray at his temples had extended. His eyes, when they found Harry's face in the dark, were the same gray they had always been, and also something more complicated. He did not say anything for a moment. Harry crossed the distance without thinking about it. He put his arms around his godfather and held on with the grip of someone who has been afraid for a long time that this moment might not arrive. The embrace that came back was the kind that happens when someone has been holding themselves very carefully together for a long period and is, briefly, allowed to stop. They stood at the Hogwarts gates in the dark, and neither of them spoke, and the castle breathed around them, warm and patient, the Heartstone's awareness carrying the distant sound of 500 students sleeping inside its walls. The suite the castle had prepared was on the third floor of the East Tower, with windows looking across the grounds toward the Forbidden Forest, a view that felt deliberate, the forest visible as something to watch over rather than be watched over in. The rooms had been empty for years, the position of High Warden having lapsed sometime in the previous century when the school had begun relying on ministry security arrangements. Sirius stood at the window for a long time. "You actually did it," he said. Not disbelief, the tone of someone updating a model of the world that hadn't previously included the fact being updated. "Hermione did most of the legal architecture," Harry said. The castle chose. I said yes." Sirius looked at him. "Harry, you're 15 and you're standing in the headmaster's robes with a crown that's been sitting in a sorting hat for 1,000 years. The crown is in the office. I don't wear it all the time. You're also running a school, with Hermione, right? Because that makes it completely normal." Harry looked at his godfather, at the dry expression, the angle of it that was almost the old grin, and wasn't quite there yet, but was working toward it, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since he'd written the first draft of the letter. "The job is real," he said. "I need someone I trust on the perimeter. Someone who knows the grounds, who can talk to the creatures, who can cover a lot of ground very fast when necessary." Sirius's mouth curved. "You want me to patrol in dog form. I want you to patrol however works best. The castle's wards will recognize your signature in both forms. Full grounds access, including the forest edge and lake perimeter." A pause. "Sirius Black," Sirius said slowly. "High Warden of Hogwarts. The position comes with a Wizengamot-recognized warrant, which gives you legal standing independent of ministry authority as long as you're acting in the school's service." Hermione spent a day and a half on the warrant language. Of course she did. He turned back to the window. The Forbidden Forest was a dark mass at the ground's edge in the moonlight. There are things in that forest. The centaurs have agreed to a mutual defense accord. Firenze advocated for it. Sirius was quiet for a moment with an expression Harry couldn't fully read, something between amusement and something more serious, refusing to settle into either. "Your father," Sirius said, "would be." He stopped. "What?" "Proud, yes, but also slightly alarmed, and he'd be covering the alarm with a joke, and Lily would tell him to stop making jokes about it, and then she'd be alarmed too, but quietly in the way she did everything." A pause, and then they'd both get over it and start arguing about the best approach to something specific, and completely lose track of being alarmed because there was a problem to solve. Harry was quiet. "You come by it honestly," Sirius said. "The not stopping." 3 nights after Sirius settled in, he brought up the Marauder's map. He arrived at the headmaster's office after his evening patrol, in human form, with the expression of someone who has been thinking about something specific for a number of miles. He sat down across the desk and placed the map on the surface between them without preamble. "The map needs formal recognition," he said, "in the charter." Harry looked at it. "No. It's the most complete magical cartography of this castle in existence, created by 4 students of this school, and it is currently classified as—" "What? A confiscated item?" "It's classified as the thing we use to run the Serpent Lion Guard's interior positioning, which is what it should be classified as." Harry, Sirius. The Charter is a founding legal document of sovereign authority. It contains provisions about wardstones and ancient compacts and the rights of magical creatures. It does not need a section about a piece of enchanted parchment that Remus Lupin made primarily to avoid getting caught out after curfew. "It was also so we could find each other in emergencies," Sirius said with some dignity. "It was mostly the curfew thing." "It was both," Sirius said firmly. He paused. "Also, I'd like it noted that calling it primarily the curfew thing is unfair to how genuinely useful it was in emergencies." Harry almost smiled. "How many emergencies did you have in school?" "That is a completely separate conversation." He left for a final circuit of the eastern grounds. He came back the following night, and then the night after that, each time with a slightly more elaborate version of the argument. Harry said no each time, and each time Sirius departed looking like he had more to say on the subject, and was saving it. On the 3rd night, Sirius came back late and sat across from Harry, not as High Warden bringing a proposal, but as something quieter than that, as a man who had walked a very large piece of ground in the dark for 3 nights, and had arrived at a different part of the question. "How are you sleeping?" he said. The question was so far outside the register of everything they'd been discussing that Harry needed a moment to change gears. Adequately, he said. That means not well. The Heartstone connection, even when I'm not actively accessing it, there's a peripheral awareness, like a second sense running alongside everything else. He paused. It's not bad, it's just not nothing. Sirius nodded slowly. James used to say that becoming an animagus was like that at first, always slightly aware of the other form's presence, even in human shape. He said it took about 6 months before it became background rather than foreground. The castle isn't going to become background. No, Sirius agreed. Probably not. He was quiet for a moment. But you'll learn to carry it better. The things we're responsible for, we learned to carry. The fire in the grate had burned to orange coals. Outside the window, the High Warden's tower was dark, which meant Sirius had come here rather than there, here at midnight in the headmaster's office having a conversation about sleep and the weight of being responsible for something very large. The map, Harry said. Sirius looked at him. It can go in the operational annex of the charter, not the main document, the annex, section 4, where Hermione filed the creature accord documentation, listed as an authorized navigational instrument of the High Warden's office. Sirius considered this carefully. With a full title? Harry sighed. What full title? The Marauder's Map, a complete survey of Hogwarts Castle and grounds, created by Messrs. Mooney, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs, in the service of exploration, mischief, and the occasional emergency. Harry looked at him for a long moment. The Wormtail part is complicated, he said. I know. Something shifted in Sirius's expression. Not loss exactly, but the acknowledgement of loss, the way someone names a grief they've learned to carry without being capsized by it. He was there when we made it. He doesn't get to be removed from it just because of what he did after. Harry thought about what it means to hold the full, complicated truth of a person, rather than the simplified version. All right, he said. I'll talk to Hermione about the annex language. Sirius almost smiled. The almost smile had been coming more frequently over the past few nights, the distance between almost and actual narrowing in the way such distances do when a person is in the right place. Get some sleep, Sirius said, and stood. You too. I'm going to do one more circuit of the eastern grounds. He moved toward the door. Tell the castle I'll be the large black dog. I don't want the Stone Knights getting ideas. Harry watched him go, then sat for a while in the quiet office. Below in the grounds, a large black dog emerged from a side door and began its circuit of the eastern perimeter with the focused, purposeful energy of something that has finally found the right size of territory. The first battle tactics and defense integration class was voluntary. Hermione had insisted on this with the firmness she used when she was right about something and was not interested in debating whether she was right. Mandatory defense training is what authoritarian institutions do, she had said. We are not an authoritarian institution. We are a sovereign school. The distinction is the point. So it was voluntary. 60 students came. They filled the room the castle had provided. Larger than any classroom, the walls hung with old maps of magical Britain and one very detailed ward diagram Hermione had reproduced in a careful hand on parchment, 6 feet wide. Every house, every year above 4th. Several students sitting on windowsills. Daphne Greengrass in the 3rd row, with the expression of someone who has been waiting for someone to ask a question large enough to match the size of her thinking. Blaise Zabini, a 5th year with the calculating intelligence of someone who processes exits before committing to a room, had taken the seat nearest the door, which Harry noted and which told him something useful about how Zabini thought. Luna Lovegood sat in the back corner, apparently uninvited and uninstructed to leave, which at this point Harry accepted as simply how things were. Neville, at a desk near the middle, sat with a straightness of posture that had not been there a year ago. Harry stood at the front and looked at them. The first thing I'm going to tell you, he said, is that I'm not an authority on any of this. He heard someone near the back shift in surprise. I survived things I shouldn't have survived, mostly because of luck and because I had people around me who were better at thinking under pressure than I was. He looked at the room. What I can do is tell you exactly how those situations went wrong and right, and we can figure out together what to do differently. He spent the first 90 minutes on the Triwizard Tournament's final task. Not the maze, the graveyard, the night Voldemort returned. He had spent the previous evening reconstructing the sequence from memory, mapping it on a large piece of parchment with the cold precision of someone preparing a document rather than reliving an experience. He walked them through the portkey, the binding, the confrontation that was not a duel in any conventional sense, the specific decisions made in a state of shock and exhaustion and complete isolation. He was honest about his own errors. He said, "I made the wrong call here, and I had no information and acted on instinct, which nearly killed me, without softening any of it into lessons about bravery or necessity." It had been a confrontation between a boy with insufficient preparation and something that had been planning for over a decade. The question was not whether he had been brave enough. The question was how to never be that isolated and underprepared again. By the end of his account, 6 hands were up. Daphne Greengrass asked first. If you had no signaling method available, the primary failure was a communication breakdown before the task even began. Was there ever any discussion among tournament participants about establishing emergency protocols? No, Harry said. So the training failure was structural, not individual. Yes, she wrote something. Zabini, from his seat by the door, said, "What would have changed the outcome if you'd had one person with you who had advanced intelligence on what Riddle intended?" "Everything," Harry said, "or enough. So the single most valuable resource would have been information." "Yes." Luna, without raising her hand, said from the back, "Do you think he chose that location because of its emotional significance to him, or purely for its ward properties?" A different kind of silence fell over the room. Several students turned to look at her. Harry thought about it properly, the way the question deserved. "Both," he said. And that made it worse. He was rebuilding himself in a place that meant something to him, which means understanding him mattered as much as understanding the magic. Luna nodded, satisfied, and returned to whatever she'd been drawing in the margin of her notes. The session that was supposed to run 90 minutes ran 2.5 hours. Nobody left early. "What are we doing next session?" Zabini asked as people gathered their things. "Mapping the castle," Harry said. "Every choke point, every defensible position, every approach. Knowing a space is the first requirement for defending it." He gestured at the ward diagram. "We complete this together." Zabini looked at the diagram, then at Harry. He had the expression of someone who had arrived expecting one thing and found something else, and was revising his assessment in real time. He was the last one out the door, which Harry also noted. Snape came to the office at 8 o'clock precisely. He entered without ceremony, which was itself a form of ceremony for Snape, the deliberate absence of performance communicating that what followed was not for an audience. He settled into the chair across the desk, folded his hands, and looked at Harry with the expression he deployed when he was about to say something that cost him something. "I would prefer," Snape said, "that this conversation not leave this room." "All right. I would also prefer that you resist the impulse to express satisfaction at anything I am about to tell you." "I'll try." Snape's eyes moved to the door, the window, the portraits, which were, Harry noticed, looking away with a coordinated innocence that suggested they were paying extremely close attention. "Portraits," Harry said quietly. "Privacy, please." The painted faces shifted collectively, settling into the studied inattention they deployed when a headmaster required it. Not asleep, simply elsewhere. Snape watched this happen, and something almost imperceptible changed in his expression. "Albus trusted me with a secret he did not share with the Order, with the Ministry, or with you," Snape said. "He has been removed from the castle before he had the opportunity to convey it." A pause. "I am conveying it instead, under protest." Harry said nothing. The room was quiet. "I have been a spy for the Order of the Phoenix since before you were born," Snape said. "Not a reluctant convert, and not a defector from convenience. A spy. For nearly 2 decades, I have provided intelligence from inside Voldemort's inner circle. Intelligence that has saved lives you will never know the names of." He said it without drama, without self-congratulation, like a man reading facts from a file he has read too many times. Albus was the only person in possession of this information. He is now gone, and you are headmaster. Harry looked at him for a long moment. "Does Voldemort trust you?" "At present, yes. I have given him no reason not to, and you want to continue." "I want the work to continue," Snape said with a precision that made the distinction clear. "What I want personally is somewhat beside the point." Harry thought about what it meant to hold that kind of secret for nearly 2 decades. About the courage it required, and the particular loneliness that came with it, the loneliness of someone whose sacrifice could never be acknowledged, because acknowledgement would destroy its purpose. About the fact that Snape had come here, to a 15-year-old boy he had spent 5 years treating with something just short of open contempt, because there was no one else. "All right," Harry said. Snape looked at him. All right, you continue. Significant intelligence through the portrait network when it arrives. Use Phineas. He's already operating as a secure channel, and frankly, I think he enjoys the work more than he's willing to admit. Harry paused. And Snape. Potter. What Dumbledore asked of you, what you've been doing, I know it isn't small. He held Snape's gaze. The school knows it isn't small. Something moved across Snape's face so briefly that Harry almost missed it. Not gratitude, too simple a word. Closer to relief, the specific relief of someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time, and has just been told, for the first time, that the carrying has not been invisible. He stood. He inclined his head. The smallest possible gesture, barely movement at all. Your mother, Snape said, without turning, would have found the situation simultaneously horrifying and exactly what was needed. He left. Harry sat in the headmaster's chair for a long moment after the door closed. The portraits maintained tactful absence. Eventually he said to the room, "You can stop pretending." Dilys Derwent's frame became animated immediately. "We heard nothing," she said. "Nothing at all," agreed Everard. "Absolutely nothing," Phineas said from his frame, in the tone of someone whose definition of nothing was doing a great deal of structural work. Harry looked at Phineas. "How long have you known?" The former headmaster considered this with visible deliberateness. "Albus told me," Phineas said finally, "a very long time ago. He asked me not to share it unless the information became necessary for the continuation of the work." A pause. "I am capable of many things people find unexpected. Keeping secrets is among the less impressive of them." Harry picked up his quill. The ward diagram waited. Below him, the school continued its evening. Students in common rooms, teachers at their desks, a black dog making its careful circuit of the eastern grounds. Somewhere under the castle, a 1,000-year-old guardian breathed in the stone. He went back to work. Ron Weasley took the news approximately the way Hermione had predicted. He argued, with genuine feeling, that being Harry's best friend ought to count as a qualification for something. Harry explained carefully that it did. It counted as a reason to be trusted, but that the positions available had specific requirements, and best friend was not among them. Hermione said nothing during this exchange, which was the most eloquent expression of "I told you so" Harry had ever witnessed. Ron was made warden of the North Tower in mid-autumn, responsible for coordinating student security in the castle's northern residential sections, and serving as liaison between the Serpent Lion Guard and the main defensive network. The position suited him better than either of them initially said aloud. Ron had a gift for reading people quickly, for seeing the social architecture of a situation before anyone else did, for communicating urgency without producing panic. He was, it turned out, a natural. He was insufferable about the best friend point for approximately 2 weeks. The phrase sovereign duo arrived in the school's vocabulary without ceremony, appearing first in a letter home from a third-year Hufflepuff, then in conversation, then in the way accurate language tends to spread through communities, recognized immediately as the right description, and so becoming simply what everyone said. Harry and Hermione were everywhere during those first weeks. They were seen in the corridor outside the kitchen talking to house elves, at the Forbidden Forest's edge meeting with Firenze, in the headmaster's office at midnight, in the study at dawn, in classrooms and the courtyard, and on the outer walls. The school transformed the way places transform when what was wrong with them is addressed, not in a single visible change, but in accumulation. Students talked in corridors without the hunched quality that Umbridge's surveillance had installed in them. Teachers moved through the school with recovered authority. The Serpent Lion Guard trained at 6 a.m, and the training was not military in any conventional sense, but something more interesting. The systematic education of young witches and wizards in the deep and ancient magic of the place they lived in. Neville sent a note one morning after the Guard's 7th training session. "I've figured out what's different. Nobody's waiting to be told what they're allowed to do anymore." Harry read it twice and handed it to Hermione. She read it once and went back to the ward diagram, which was, he thought, the most accurate summary of what they were doing. The letter from Bowsbottens arrived on a gray autumn morning, delivered not by owl, but by a golden-feathered bird Harry did not immediately recognize. It landed on the headmaster's desk with the precision of something that had been told exactly where to go, accepted the piece of dried fig the castle offered from somewhere Harry didn't ask about, and departed with the same exactness. Harry read the letter twice, then he went to find Hermione. She was in the private library, working through the expanding Horcrux documentation. a system of color-coded folders she had organized so thoroughly that Harry had stopped trying to understand it and simply trusted it. She set down her quill when he placed the letter beside her. She read it, set it down, picked it up again. "She's requesting a formal meeting," Hermione said. "Madame Maxime. She wants to discuss the sovereignty model and its implications for beaux batons." Hermione looked at the letter in the mode Harry recognized as identifying implications in sequence, rather than reacting to the surface of a thing. "This is larger than us," she said. "I know. The oldest magical schools in Europe were all founded under pre-ministry legal frameworks. Every one of them is theoretically sitting on the same kind of charter documentation we found." She paused. "We weren't the first to think of this. We were the first to act on it." "Because we had no choice," Harry said. "Which means schools with choices haven't moved. Because moving costs something, funding, political protection. They become targets, unless they're not alone in it." She was very still for a moment. "Write back," she said. "Invite her, and write to Durmstrang as well. I'll draft the language." Madame Maxime arrived by powder blue carriage several weeks later, landing in the outer grounds with the delicacy of something much smaller. The centaurs had sent a message through Firenze that morning, a formal acknowledgement that the approaching carriage came in peace, which was both unnecessary and the kind of gesture that made Harry understand why Firenze had advocated for the accord. The woman who stepped down from the carriage was extraordinary in the manner of people who don't try to be extraordinary and simply are. Half-giantess, dressed in silk robes the color of deep water, with the posture of someone who has spent decades navigating a world that required her to make herself smaller than she was, and had declined to. She looked at the castle. She looked at Harry. "I heard they sent Aurors," she said. 37, Harry said, "and they returned unharmed." The castle was polite about it. Something moved in her expression. Not quite a smile, something more considered than a smile. "I have been headmistress for many years," she said. "In that time, the French ministry has sent inspectors 14 times. I have managed 14 situations through negotiation, patience, and the particular advantage of being large enough that people reconsider confrontation." She looked at the castle behind him. "I have wondered, sometimes, what it would be like to not need to manage, to simply be allowed." "That's what the charter is for," Harry said. They walked inside. The meeting ran 4 hours. Hermione had arranged the room for work rather than formality. 3 chairs around the fire, a work table with documentation organized, a clear wall space where the relevant charter sections were pinned in the order they'd need to be discussed. She had also placed a French translation of the Pre-Ministry Sovereign Institutions Act beside the English original. Harry noticed this and did not comment on it because commenting on it would take more time than they had. Maxime took in the room. She looked at the pinned documents. She looked at Hermione. "You wrote these," she said. "Some of them. The charter documents are original, 9th century, various hands. The legal briefs and Wizengamot submissions are mine." Maxime was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down, and the meeting began. She asked questions that went directly to the structural foundations of Harry's legal position, probing the strongest parts, and the parts that would face the most challenge, from a French ministry with a different legal tradition. Hermione answered all of them. Harry answered the ones that required something other than law. What it actually felt like to carry the school's awareness through your mind, like a second heartbeat. To stand at gates and tell 37 Aurors they were not coming in, and have the castle enforce it without anyone being hurt. Maxime listened to these answers differently, with the attention of someone recognizing something. "The school chose you," she said. "Yes, Beauxbatons chose me too," she said quietly, "not with a stone and a crown. But I walked into my office on the first day, and something in that building, something old, something that had been there for centuries, settled, the way things settle when they find their right position." She looked at the fire. "I have wondered for years what it would mean to make that formal. The charter gives it a legal name," Hermione said. "And protection. Yes." Maxime looked at her. "The French ministry will not be pleased." "No," Hermione agreed, "but their displeasure and their authority are different things, and which applies depends on whether Beauxbatons' foundational charter predates the ministry's jurisdiction." "It does," Maxime said, "by 3 centuries. Hermione produced a piece of parchment from the folder at her left. "Then I'll need a copy of the relevant sections. I've already drafted the framework of the Mutual Scholastic Compact. There are 2 areas where the French legal tradition requires different language, and I need your review before we submit." Maxime looked at the parchment, then at Hermione. "You drafted this before I agreed to anything. I drafted it before you arrived. In case you agreed." Maxime looked at Harry. "She does this," he said. "It's best not to fight it." Something in Maxime's expression became definitively a smile. "I begin to understand," she said, "why the Aurors went home." The letter from Durmstrang arrived while Maxime was still at Hogwarts. Grey owl, significant distance, prepared to wait. The letter alternated paragraphs in German and Russian, which Hermione read without difficulty and summarized without drawing attention to the fact that she was doing so, which Harry had learned to understand as her being tactful about a skill that could easily seem like showing off. Acting head Voronova had 3 conditions. The first 2 were language adjustments. The third was a request that the compact explicitly state that intelligence-sharing provisions did not require a school to reveal the identity of students from Death Eater families, since Durmstrang had several such students, and their safety inside the school was the school's primary obligation regardless of their families' choices. Harry read it and looked at Hermione. "Write back yes on all 3, he said. "Tell her we would have included the third condition ourselves if we'd thought of it." Hermione was already writing. The Charter of Mutual Scholastic Defense was signed at Hogwarts on a winter afternoon. No ceremony. Ceremony would have attracted ministry attention from 2 countries before the ink dried. Just Maxime at the work table, Voronova's signature arriving by emergency portkey document just before noon. Hermione with 3 copies and a verification charm. Harry with the Headmaster's seal. When the final copy was sealed, Maxime sat back. "What do we call ourselves?" she said. Harry hadn't thought about it. He looked at Hermione. "The compact schools," she said. "It's descriptive. It doesn't claim more than we've established. And if others join, then it's still accurate." Maxime considered this. "In France," she said, "we have a word. Confrérie, a community of shared purpose." "The compact schools is safer for official documentation," Harry said. "But I like the other thing. 3 schools. Their own ancient magic, their own foundational charters, their own commitment to the people inside their walls. Whatever Voldemort was building, he was building it in a world where 3 sovereign schools existed and were not targets he could use." "He won't like it," Harry said. "No." Hermione agreed. "He won't." She picked up her quill and went back to work. Harry sat down at his own desk, and the fire between them settled, and the school breathed around them in the dark. Hermione found the subchamber on a rainy afternoon, looking for something else. She had been searching for a 7th precedent for the Wizengamot Charter Review. She had 6, which should have been sufficient, but 6 felt incomplete in a way with no rational basis, and she was going to pursue the feeling anyway. The subchamber was behind the private library's innermost wall, accessible via a seam in the stone her fingers found by accident when she leaned against the shelf while reading a reference volume. The wall opened inward. The room was small and circular and cold, the cold of air undisturbed for a very long time. 17 stone pedestals arranged in a loose spiral from the center outward. On each, a pensieve, shallow stone basins, each slightly different in material and size and the quality of light that moved in them. Not the silver liquid movement of active memory, something more like potential. Each pensieve was labeled in the handwriting of whoever had donated the memories inside. She walked the spiral inward. Armando Dippet, Phillida Spore, Everard, Dillis Derwent, names from portraits from the periphery of the school's documented past. Each pensieve containing what its label described, a contribution, a donation of memory, left by a previous headmaster for the school's institutional record. The pedestal at the center of the spiral was different from the others, larger. The handwriting on its label was familiar, for the headmaster who comes after, if they have courage enough. APWBD. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went to find Harry. He stood in the doorway and said nothing for a moment. "He knew," Harry said. "He knew he might not be available to deliver it himself," Hermione said. "So he built a contingency." She showed him the small folded note leaning against the pedestal's base. The handwriting said, "Begin with the Slug Club memory, end with the cave." Between them, the shape of what was done to a boy who was never shown another way to be. On the back, in smaller writing, "I am sorry it has taken this long to reach you." Harry read it over her shoulder. He was quiet for a moment. "Tonight," he said, "we start tonight." The first memory was the Slug Club dinner. They entered it together and arrived in the warm, overcrowded space of Horace Slughorn's preserved sitting room, where a young Tom Riddle sat across from the professor with the attentiveness of a very intelligent person who has identified what they want from a conversation and is steering it there. The interesting part was not the Horcrux question. The interesting part was the moment just before, the flash across Riddle's expression when Slughorn showed genuine pleasure in him, something younger than the careful performance, something that did not know how to receive being valued for its own sake, and was covering that not knowing with a sophistication built precisely for that purpose. They stepped out of the memory. Harry stood still. He wanted to know if it could be done, he said. But before that, he wanted Slughorn to think well of him. Yes, Hermione said, writing. Both things were real. That's what makes it complicated. They watched the second memory, the third, the fourth. Each was a piece of architecture Dumbledore had assembled over years. The orphanage, the cabinet, the diary's creation, the trail of objects chosen for their significance to a boy who had nothing and took everything. The shape of a person becoming something else, through individual decisions that seemed almost small, and collectively constituted something vast and terrible. Between each memory they returned to the cold room, and talked through what they had seen. Harry brought instinct, the felt sense of what he was watching. Hermione brought framework, the way of situating it in relation to everything else they knew. By the fourth memory it was past midnight, and the room had warmed slightly with their presence. By the fifth, the cave, something in Harry had already shifted. He entered it, knowing what it meant. They saw the locket lifted from the basin, and in its place a small piece of parchment in handwriting neither of them recognized, signed with initials. R.A.B. They stepped out of the memory and stood in the cold room without speaking for a long moment. Regulus Arcturus Black, Hermione said. Sirius's brother, a Death Eater who defected, who died late in the decade before the First War ended. She looked at him. Who had a house elf who served the Black family and is currently, after a fashion, at Hogwarts. Creature, Harry said. Creature. The silence had the texture of something important waiting to be confirmed. He was there, Harry said. Creature was there. He must know. Tomorrow, Hermione said. We talk to Sirius first, then Creature. She reached for her notebook, then stopped. She looked at the note again. I am sorry it has taken this long to reach you. She closed the notebook. They sat in the circular room in the dark, and neither of them reached for a document or a diagram. The castle kept its watch around them, and for a little while, that was enough. The conversation with Sirius happened the following morning, and it cost him something he did not name but that left him quieter for several days. The conversation with Creature happened that afternoon, 3 hours long, requiring patience and a willingness to extend respect to a house elf who had never expected it, and who, when he finally understood that Regulus's sacrifice was known and honored by the people now in authority over these walls, wept with a grief that had nowhere else to go. Harry sat across from Creature on the kitchen floor and waited until the grief ran its course and something else emerged, something that looked, for the first time, like purpose. The locket was retrieved from Grimmauld Place in the days that followed. The first Horcrux was destroyed in the Heartstone's chamber on a morning in the depths of winter. Hermione had developed the destruction method over weeks of careful research. Harry provided the Parseltongue command. The thing inside the locket screamed, briefly, and then there was only empty metal, tarnished and inert on the stone floor. Voldemort felt it. Harry knew because he felt Voldemort feel it, the soul fragment in his scar registering the loss, the way a body registers the removal of something it hadn't known was connected. Not pain exactly, something worse than pain. The sensation of a certainty dissolving. He'll move, Hermione said when he told her. Not immediately. He'll take time to understand what happened. But the calculation changes when he realizes someone has the knowledge and the access. She looked at him steadily. He'll move toward the school. How long? Weeks, not months. She reached for the Horcrux documentation. We need the diadem before he arrives. The diadem was found in the room of requirement 3 days later. The castle knew he was coming. Harry felt it first as a change in the Heartstone's warmth, not cooling, but intensifying the way warmth intensifies when something very cold approaches and the source of heat responds. He was reviewing ward documentation in the headmaster's office when it happened. He stopped reading. He sat still for a moment, feeling the castle's awareness reorient toward the north. Then he stood and went to the mirror network. Sirius. Northern perimeter. How many? The response came back controlled, the tone of someone who has been patrolling long enough to trust what he sees. More than I can count from the tree line. Giants. Something at the far northern edge that's draining the warmth out of the air. And Harry, he's here. I can feel it. The forest is going quiet in the wrong direction. Stay at the perimeter. Don't engage. Understood. Harry went to find Hermione. She was already in the corridor outside the office. Ward diagram rolled under, one arm moving toward him. I felt the wards shift, she said. He's here. They looked at each other. Everything they had built over the preceding months, the legal architecture and the pensive archive, and the basilisk in the walls and the portrait network, and the compact schools and the two desks facing each other across the hearth, all of it had been arriving at this. Students first, Harry said, already sending the message. She had the mirror network communicator in hand. Serpent Lion Guard to interior positions. Everyone else to common rooms. Neville, Harry said through the network, you have the guard. Interior positions, map-based communication, nobody engages outside unless the interior is breached. Neville's voice came back with a steadiness that would have seemed impossible a year ago. Yes, we're already moving. Ron's voice, North Tower is sealed. 3rd and 4th years are accounted for. We've got the map running. Luna's voice, entirely calm. I'm in the Ravenclaw corridor. I've been explaining to the 2nd years that this is actually very unlikely to be as bad as it sounds. And most of them believe me. The ones who don't are at least distracted. Harry went to the Heartstone. The chamber's entrance opened before he spoke because the castle was already fully awake in a way he hadn't felt before. Every room alert, every corridor aware. The accumulated magic of a millennium of learning and protection reaching for what it had been built to do. He pressed his hands against the stone. The warmth came immediately, enormous and complete, the castle pouring through him with a depth that made every previous connection feel like standing at the shoreline. This was the full water, the castle at complete extension. He felt everything. Every student, every teacher, every defender at their position. Sirius at the northern tree line in Padfoot's form, moving with the knowledge of ground he had walked 100 nights. The Serpent Lion Guard at their interior positions, Ron coordinating the North Tower with a calm Harry could feel through the network. Luna in the corridor outside the Ravenclaw common room, and whatever she was saying to frightened 2nd years was working, because the fear Harry sensed through the castle's awareness was settling rather than escalating. And beyond the walls, the cold, not temperature, absence, Dementors moving across the northern grounds, generating the specific chill of things that feed on warmth and are approaching warmth. And at the center of it all, further back, a presence the Heartstone recognized the way a body recognizes something it has fought before. Something that had once been known here, that had taken from these walls only power and none of the other things being offered, and had never returned anything. Defend them, Harry said to the castle. Not violently, not by hurting anyone, but completely. The warmth spread through his hands and into his chest, and the castle received the purpose the way it always had, not as a command, but as an intention it had been waiting for clarity to execute. The stone knights came first, not just the suits of armor, everything carved and shaped and placed along the exterior of the building for 1,000 years. The castle emptying its architecture into the outer grounds in one sustained, unhurried wave. Not rushing, simply positioning, walls of stone between the approaching forces and the interior, redirecting available paths the way water redirects through stone. The giants met them and met them and met them again, every advance redirected, the castle's reserves deeper than anything that could be exhausted in a single night. The Dementors hit the school's northern boundary and stopped. The Heartstone was projecting something that had no adequate name in any defense against the dark arts textbook, not a Patronus in the wand magic sense, but the accumulated weight of 1,000 years of sanctuary. Every student who had ever felt safe here, every moment of genuine protection, every act of courage and loyalty and patient hope performed in these corridors and left in the stone. The Dementors had nothing to offer that was stronger than that. 3 turned back immediately. The remaining pressed against the boundary and found themselves moving in the wrong direction without understanding why. Within minutes, all of them had retreated past the perimeter. Hermione's voice came through the mirror network from the headmaster's office, tracking ward integrity across all 4 perimeters. Northern wards at 92%. Giants targeting the outer wall section between towers, 2 and 3. Redirect the stone knights from the eastern approach. That side is holding without them. Harry adjusted. The castle adjusted through him. This was what the months had built, not just legal architecture. Two people who thought better in proximity, who had learned to operate as a single instrument, the castle's will expressed through Harry's connection and Hermione's mapping mind tracking every variable and calling every adjustment in real time. Voldemort reached the outer gates at midnight. Harry felt him arrive the way the castle felt him, as something that had once been known here, carrying the residue of a boy who had walked these corridors and eaten in this hall and taken from them only power and none of the other things that had been on offer. The castle recognized him, not warmly, with the recognition of a place that has been wronged by someone who took something and never gave it back. Through the Heartstone's awareness, Harry felt the basilisk stir in the walls. Not the outer walls, the deep walls. The chamber's ancient stone, the distributed consciousness that moved through the school's foundations. The basilisk felt Voldemort the way it had always felt the air of Slytherin, but the feeling had changed. The compulsion was gone. There was no command structure between them, only the basilisk's own assessment, made in its slow and patient way, of the person at the gates. Voldemort spoke. Harry felt it happen before he heard it, felt the parcel tongue move through the stone, the familiar command register of someone who had never in his life addressed a serpent as anything other than an instrument. The command was simple and ancient, and carried the full weight of a magical inheritance that had made Voldemort what he was. The basilisk did not answer. Harry felt the silence that followed as something physical, the basilisk's awareness considering the command from a position of genuine freedom, for perhaps the first time in 1,000 years, and deciding. The decision was no. Not because Harry had instructed it, not because the castle commanded it, because it had been asked to choose, months ago, by the person who held the school's sovereign authority, and it had chosen the school. And the school was not that. Voldemort had never, in all his long and terrible existence, commanded a serpent that refused him. Harry felt this land and the presence at the gates as something without an easy name, deeper than confusion, the specific sensation of a foundational certainty developing its first crack, something that had been inviolable for decades encountering inviolability of a different kind. He held the Heartstone and breathed and held. Voldemort withdrew before the first gray hint of dawn, not because he was defeated. Harry understood this without illusion. The forces had not been exhausted. He withdrew because the calculation had changed. The school was not what he had modeled it to be. Not a vulnerable institution to be taken in a single night. Not something he could use. And something else. Something in the wards that resonated with a part of himself he had worked very hard to make inaccessible. The castle's ancient magic carried the warmth of 1,000 years of sanctuary, and the fragment of soul in Harry's scar had been, all night, pressing against that warmth the way something cold and imprisoned presses against a window. He felt his own fragment reaching toward the school's magic, and withdrew from what that recognition meant. Harry stood at the Heartstone for a long time after, letting the castle settle, feeling the wards repair their minor breaches with the organic competence of something that has been healing itself for 1,000 years, and knows exactly how. Then he climbed back to the surface. The students came down without being told. Harry felt it through the castle's awareness before he reached the Great Hall. 500 people moving from their positions toward the same space, not in panic, not in celebration, simply in the way people move toward the center of something when it's been resolved and they need to be where other people are. He and Hermione entered the Great Hall together. The room was already full. Every house, every year, Neville near the Hufflepuff table. He had migrated there again at some point during the night. And Susan Bones was beside him, and neither of them looked like they had been alone during any of it. Ron at the back of the hall, coordinating with the last guard members filtering in, his expression carrying the exhausted calm of someone who has run a difficult shift and is now making sure everyone is accounted for before he stops. Luna near the Ravenclaw section, talking quietly to a group of younger students who had the look of people who had been frightened and were now listening to something that made the fear manageable. Snape at the edge of the room, arms folded, watching everything with an expression that communicated nothing except that he was watching. But he was watching, which was different from a year ago. 500 students turned to look at Harry. "The castle held," he said. It was not a speech. It was what had happened, stated simply, given room to be what it was. No one inside these walls was harmed. The outer wards sustained minor damage the castle is already repairing. He looked at the room. He'll come back. I won't tell you otherwise. But we know now what this school can do, and we know what we're capable of, and those are things that don't change. The room was quiet in the manner of people absorbing rather than waiting. Neville Longbottom, from the Hufflepuff table, began to clap. He always started it. It had become one of the year's fixed points. This time the entire hall came in at once, without stages, the sound arriving complete and sustained. And Harry stood in it and did not try to stop it, because the castle deserved it even if he wasn't sure he did. Hermione appeared at his shoulder. "Ward repair estimate," she said quietly under the sound. 4 days for full restoration. The wall section between towers 2 and 3 will need stone replacement. I'll contact the castle's maintenance enchantments this morning. This morning, he agreed, because it was already morning. Later, after the students had gone back to sleep, after Ron had swept the North Tower and reported in with characteristic thoroughness, after Hermione had made her initial damage assessment, Harry sat in the headmaster's office and opened the communication crystal. The ministry's receiving chamber appeared in the refracted light, Fudge's office beyond it. The minister himself, standing, having been informed the crystal had activated. Harry looked at him through the glass. He looked tired. Not physically, politically tired, the exhaustion of someone managing a public fiction and finding the management increasingly expensive. 37 Aurors came here, Harry said. 37 returned tonight unharmed, with nothing to file as an incident report except their own account of a castle that declined to admit them. I want you to understand that was a choice, not an inability, a choice. Fudge's expression moved through several configurations. There is a war coming, Harry said. Part of you already knows this. Otherwise you wouldn't be afraid of me, you'd simply dismiss me. Every Auror standing outside my gates is an Auror not standing between ordinary people and what's coming. He paused. I can't change what you believe, but I can make sure that when you find out I was right, you find out with more of your people alive. He held Fudge's gaze for a moment. Please, he said, because he was Harry Potter, and the word was not a strategic softening. It was simply what was true. He ended the connection. The office was quiet. Dilly Derwent's portrait said softly, "That was well done." The ministry won't send Aurors here again, Hermione said from her desk, not looking up. Fudge's political position can't absorb a second failed deployment. The first is already being reported through the portrait network. He might send someone else, not Aurors. Yes, she set down her quill, but not today. And today is what we had to manage. Harry looked at the dark crystal. Then, at the window, through which the grounds were visible in the flat early light, the outer courtyard empty, the stone knights returned to their wall positions, the sky above the castle clear and cold and entirely ordinary. 37 Aurors going home without injuries, the basilisk in the walls having made its choice, the castle still standing, 500 students still sleeping inside it. He picked up the ward diagram. What are you working on? He asked. Hermione picked up her quill. Charter review submission, curriculum review for the spring term. The Centaur Accord's secondary provisions. Also, one at a time, Harry said. I can manage several at a time. I know. I'm asking for my sake. She stopped. She looked at him. Then she set down everything except the top document on her left stack and handed it across the space between their desks. Charter review, she said. Start with sections 1 through 4. Tell me if the argument in section 3 needs restructuring. He took it. He began to read. Below them, the school breathed. Outside the walls, the world continued in its complicated way, full of things that had not yet arrived. Inside the walls, for now, it was simply 2 people at 2 desks and the work that needed doing. A year passed. Not quietly. The war did not allow quiet, but with the particular rhythm that difficult work develops when it has enough structure to contain it. The Horcrux hunt had 3 more to go when winter ended. The ring was destroyed in spring, carefully and without incident, the methodical precision that had become the hunt's defining quality, ensuring that nothing was rushed and nothing improvised. The cup was identified and confirmed through a combination of pensive evidence and weeks of patient intelligence work, serious coordinating between the school's network and contacts across the wizarding world. Snape's reports arriving through Phineas at irregular but crucial intervals, filling in what neither portraits nor ghosts could reach. The projected timeline on the cabinet's inside door moved earlier with each revision, not because Hermione was optimistic, because she was accurate and the work was proceeding. The Board of Governors had been dissolved and replaced by an advisory council in the depths of winter. Harry had not attended the first session. Hermione had, with 3 folders of documentation, and returned 4 hours later to report that every item on the agenda had been approved. She had written the agenda. Lucius Malfoy's application for council membership arrived in autumn, was reviewed, was placed in a folder labeled with his name and the annotation No, and received a formal response citing Article 17. He did not submit a second application. Draco Malfoy remained at Hogwarts. Something was changing in him, slowly, with the inevitability of things that happen when an environment changes and the person in it is paying sufficient attention to notice. He did his work. He did not make other students' lives worse. In the weeks following the night of the attack, 3 separate witnesses reported that he had told a first-year Muggle-born named Oliver Chen to stop apologizing for not knowing things he had no way of knowing. "You're here to learn," Draco had apparently said, in a tone stripped of every Malfoy performance. "That's what the school is for." Nobody made a formal thing of it. Some changes are best received quietly, allowed to become the new shape of a person without the weight of observation pressing on them. Harry thought about it occasionally anyway. About Draco at 11, on platform 9 3/4, performing his father, and Draco at 16, in the corridor of a sovereign school, telling a first year the thing the school had always been for. The school changed people. It always had. That was the point. The exchange students from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang had arrived in the depths of winter. 8 from Beauxbatons, 4 from Durmstrang. And the school absorbed them with the adaptability of a place that had always known learning came in more than one tradition. The compact schools had begun functioning as an intelligence-sharing body as well as an educational one, with Maxime's portrait network and Voronova's Eastern contacts adding dimensions to what Hogwarts could provide alone. The year-end assembly was on a Friday in early summer. Not a leaving feast. Harry had made this distinction explicitly in the planning discussions, and Hermione had agreed immediately because she understood its importance. The students who were leaving were not simply finishing. They were returning to a world they had been equipped to inhabit and help change. The occasion warranted acknowledgement of what that meant. The Great Hall was full, every house table, every year. 3 teachers from Beauxbatons in powder blue, 2 from Durmstrang in dark red, the exchange students distributed through the hall at the tables they had adopted as their own over the year. Sirius, at the end of the high table in human form, looking more himself than Harry had ever seen him, which was something he noticed and was glad of, and said nothing about, because saying it would embarrass him. Flitwick, with barely suppressed academic delight that had been his baseline state for most of the year, McGonagall with the expression she wore when she approved of something and had decided not to make a production of it, Sprout with dirt on her sleeve she hadn't noticed. Snape with his arms folded and his expression unreadable in the way it was when he was watching something and had not yet decided what to do with what he saw, but watching, which was itself different from a year ago. Neville near the Hufflepuff table, Ron at the end of the high table between 2 guard members, catching Harry's eye and giving him a small nod that conveyed approximately 15 things, none of which either of them would say aloud. Luna in the back of the Ravenclaw section, drawing something with great concentration that probably wasn't related to the occasion and was probably important anyway. The portraits awake on every wall, as they always were now. Harry stood at the podium in his headmaster's robes and looked at 500 students and 12 from other countries, and every teacher who had chosen to stay and work under an arrangement that had no precedent, and that they had made work anyway. He had not written notes. He never would. A year ago, he said, I sat in this chair for the first time and felt very small and very certain simultaneously, which was an unusual combination. He looked at the room. I still feel that. Both things, most days. I think that's probably correct. The hall was quiet in the manner of people attending to something rather than waiting for something. Hogwarts was always a school, he said, a place where things were learned that mattered. That part hasn't changed. What's changed is that it's also now a promise, made in the stone of this building 10 centuries ago, and waiting, for most of that time, for someone to make it explicit. He looked at the Gryffindor table, at the Slytherin table, where Draco Malfoy was watching with the careful attention of someone taking notes he'd review later, at the Hufflepuffs and Ravenclaws, and exchange students and the guard members standing at the edges of the room, at Sirius, at Ron, at Neville, at Luna, who had stopped drawing and was watching him with the serene directness of someone for whom the moment is exactly what it appears to be. Nothing more and nothing less. At the portraits above every door, "The promise is this," Harry said. "You will be taught everything this place can teach. You will be protected while you are here. You will not be used as instruments of someone else's agenda or sacrificed to someone else's comfort. And what you carry when you leave, the knowledge, the practice, the understanding of what you are capable of, belongs to you, not to the ministry, not to any government, to you." He paused. "My mother was a Muggle-born. My father was a pureblood. Voldemort killed them because he had a theory about what kind of blood matters. Hogwarts has always had a different theory. We've held it for 1,000 years. He looked at the room. I'm here to make sure it stays that way." He stepped back from the podium. He had no graceful way to end a speech. He never would. "Dinner's ready," he said. "You should eat." The hall erupted. 500 people feeling something at the same time, with no more complicated response than simple enormous noise that hit the ancient walls and came back changed, richer, having been absorbed into the stone like everything else that had ever mattered in this building. He went up to the headmaster's office very late. After the students were asleep, he sat at the desk without lighting the lamp. The fire had settled to coals, orange and low. The portraits murmured in the low manner of people in the same room at the end of a long day, not discussing anything important, simply present, which was its own kind of importance. Through the window, the school grounds lay in the summer dark, the lake, the forest, the outer walls, the towers with their torches. He placed one hand flat against the stone wall beside the window. The warmth came immediately, patient and complete, the way it always came, the castle's recognition, the Heartstone's answer to the presence of the person it had chosen. Not rushing, simply there, as it had been for a year, as it would be for however long the work required. Below, the basilisk breathed in the deep walls. At the forest's edge, a large black dog moved through the dark in its quiet circuit of the grounds. 500 students slept beneath an enchanted sky. Hermione came in without knocking, because she never knocked. She had a book under one arm and a document in the other hand, and her hair escaping at 3 separate points, and she stopped when she saw his expression. She set the document down without comment. She sat in the chair by the fire, not at her desk, but close, the way she sat when the conversation was not work but the other thing their work had become. The thing that was not romance, and not simply friendship, but something without a satisfying name, something closer to the castle itself in its nature. Ancient, warm, fundamental. "What?" she said. He shook his head. He had been trying to find the word for what he was feeling and not finding it. "We didn't build this," he said finally. "We didn't create it. We just didn't let it be taken." She was quiet for a moment. "I think that might be the harder thing." He looked at her, at the firelight on her face, at the book she had set down, at the attention she brought to things that mattered, which was everything she brought to everything. "Do you think they'd approve?" he said. "The founders?" She considered this seriously, the way she considered things that deserved it. Gryffindor would approve enthusiastically and slightly recklessly. Hufflepuff would say it took longer than it should have. Ravenclaw would want to review the legal briefs and has notes. She paused. Slytherin wouldn't like you at all, but would be privately impressed. Harry looked at the window. At the school outside it, "That's fine," he said. "Yes," Hermione said. "I thought you'd say that." The fire settled in the grate, the portraits murmured. The castle breathed around them. Every corridor, every classroom, every sleeping student, and every stone that had absorbed a century of someone's hope and held it still, patient, available. Harry kept his hand against the wall. The stone was warm. It had been warm for 1,000 years. It would be warm when tonight's work was done and tomorrow's work began, and the war reached its resolution, and everything that was coming finally arrived. It would be warm, because that was what it was. What it had always been, what it would go on being long after the 2 people sitting in the firelight had become portraits on its walls, watching the next person who needed a school to choose them. The Heartstone's warmth moved through his palm and into his chest. The castle knew them. It had always known them. It was waiting for them to know it back. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.